All right. I know you're excited about question 95. So let's get to her, shall we? Really, in question 95, these two, it's 4 articles. But these two we don't, I think, really need. He's talking about this guy named Isidore. And Isidore of Sevilla, or Seville, in Spain, he was around in like the 500s, 600s. And he was an archbishop and scholar and theologian. And anyways, he was known to be like, the expert on all this kind of stuff. But really, I don't think we need to spend too much time on it, because it's rather specific. So let's us focus on questions 1 and 2. So let's have a look at what questions 1 and 2 are telling us. So again, back to our, wait, I went to the wrong one. I was curious about something. Hang on. Yeah, speaking of being curious about something, so just to give you a sense of all the stuff that he's talking about, look at this. He talks about the will, good and evil, passions. And look at all these things are essentially sins, concupiscence and all this sort of thing. Habits, vice and sin, all this kind of stuff. And then we get to law. And kind of in a way, if you're religious, where the rubber meets the road is in here, old and new law. And specifically the law of the gospel and stuff. But we're not going to talk about that, because what we're after with Aquinas is the nature of law and, the deal on how to, in general, determine what is good. But if you're a Christian, this is kind of where you would go for your specific guidance, right? We'll come back to this at the end when we put Aquinas, all together. But just FYI, remember that we're only doing little chunks of things, right? So anyway, let's pick up our stuff on human law. Okay. Whether it was useful for laws to be framed by men. In other words, was it beneficial? I mean, and again, of course it was, right? But let's see what he says. Okay, so at the end of the day, he says, as stated above, man has a natural aptitude for virtue, but the perfection of virtue must be acquired by training. So that's important, right? So in other words, it's we have reason, and because of reason and whatever, we do have the capacity for virtue. But, virtue as a characteristic or a skill still needs training, right? So you can be talented in something, but talent won't make you proficient. You still have to practice and learn the thing, right? Continuing. Thus we observe that man is helped by industry in his necessities, for instance, in food and clothing. Industry means hard work. Certain beginnings of these he has from nature, vis-a-vis his reason and his hands. But he has not the full complement as other animals have, to whom nature has given sufficiency of clothing and food. Okay, so what? We do have natural capacities to work on the stuff we need to survive. Unlike animals who are fully furnished, right? Okay. Now, it's difficult to see how man could suffice for himself in the matter of his training, since the perfection of virtue consists chiefly in withdrawing man from undue pleasures, to which, above all, man is inclined, especially the young, who are, here's the thing, more capable of being trained. Okay, so this is important here, right? He's talking about, for us to do anything, we have to learn. We have to be trained, right? Which means in order to learn and train, we have to be able to move away from our dependence on pleasure. People, it's interesting, he says this, most sins, according to Aquinas, are sins of pleasure, right? It's usually pleasure that moves us away from what is good. So mama rabbits don't have to really train the baby rabbits too hard on how to run, right? But notice how much training goes into human beings to be able to, survive in a political economy, right? Like, here you are listening to this video, on something you probably would normally not care too much about. Why? Because it's part of your training and education to get a career, right? So why are you listening right now? Part of the reason you're listening right now, because it's probably not the most exciting thing ever, is because you have been able to master your need for undue pleasures. In other words, right now as you're listening to this, you're thinking likely of 1,000 other things you'd rather be doing, right? But you're not being tempted away to do those things because you have the discipline, ultimately, to stay here and be educated, right? That's what he's talking about. Consequently, man needs to receive his training from another, whereby to arrive at the perfection of virtue. So in other words, we need teachers. And as to those young people who are inclined to acts of virtue by their good natural disposition, or by custom or the gift of God, paternal training suffices, which is by admonitions. In other words, some people are lucky that they're, tend to listen to their parents, and they seem to have a natural disposition to do virtuous things, right? So they're lucky. But some of them are depraved and prone to vice. I guess that's the rest of us, right? And not easily amenable to words. It's necessary for such to be restrained from evil by force and fear, in order that at least they might desist from evil doing and leave others in peace, and that they themselves, by being habituated in this way, might be brought to do willingly what hitherto they did from fear, and thus become virtuous. What is he saying? So, would you agree that it would be virtuous to be organized? It would be a good characteristic to be organized, right? Absolutely. So, I'm a parent. My son's room is a disaster. Kids' rooms are always a disaster. Wouldn't it be nice if I could say, oh, why, son, you should really live in an organized environment. So why don't you straighten this up? And he'd be like, oh, yes, of course. That's a great idea, Dad. But that's not how it works, right? How it works is I got to ride him and threaten him with punishments and taking away things he likes and, battling all the time. Why? Because they don't like to desist from evil doing and leave others in peace by themselves. Because it's not fun. They don't want to. They don't want to do things that are not fun. Kids always want to do things that are only fun. So there are maybe a small minority that would be like, oh, no, since this is a good idea, I'm going to do it. However, for the rest of us, you got to use force and fear, right? And the force and fear, it comes in, one, the force is you got to do it because I'm your dad and I'm going to start taking stuff away. The fear comes in, I guess sometimes, I have to get a little angry because you need to up the, start rationally and move through your way up to DEFCON 4, right? But notice the deal is, then they become habituated in this way. So the idea is, I throw the laws down on my son. My son doesn't like it, but we both need the law, right? Because the law brings with it punishments and fear, right? But the idea is, I'm using that law and that punishment and fear to move my son toward virtue, right? It's the same thing with the cops. Like, why are there speed traps? Why do you have to pay money because you're speeding? Because it's a punishment. It's a fear thing, right? It's like, so you pay the money and it's like, ouch, that hurts. And so now you're always fearful of speeding. So eventually, after a couple speeding tickets, you perhaps habituate yourself not to speed. That's the logic behind it. Now, this kind of training, which compels through the fear of punishment, is the discipline of laws. Therefore, in order that man might have peace and virtue, it was necessary for laws to be framed, blah, blah, blah. Bam. So, are human laws beneficial? Absolutely. In the same way that they benefit a family, that the children have laws, because those laws will hopefully habituate them to be virtuous. so you need it with the whole society. Which, notice he's kind of saying then that most people are like children, which you may or may not agree. Article 2, its origin. In other words, is every law derived from the natural law? Now, why is this significant? Well, remember, natural law is the rational animal's participation in the eternal law. Remember that? So natural law has to pertain to everybody. And the deal is, follow back to like Augustine. Remember Augustine talked about city of God, city of man. Well, just because a government puts a law on you does not necessarily mean that it is a real law, a just law, and one that you have to follow. So remember in the scheme, what was it, 94, we talked about the types of law, right? Eternal, divine, natural, human. Natural laws are an emanation of divine law and eternal law. Therefore, human laws should be derived from natural laws. That's the shtick. And if they're not, then they're not law. That's the whole point. So let's go to the I answer that here. He says, I answer that which is just, that which is not just seems to be no law at all. Exactly. Wherefore the force of a law depends on the extent of its justice. So remember that, right? There can be unjust laws, right? For a while in this country, slavery was legal. There were laws that gave some people the power to enslave other people. Now, in human affairs, a thing is said to be just from being right, according to the rule of reason. But the first rule of reason is the law of nature, as is clear from what was stated above. Consequently, every human law has just so much of the nature of law as it is derived from the law of nature. Okay. Oh yeah, and then anything that deviates is a perversion of law. So here's his point. If you're going to try to say, command a law that all human beings should fly, that's neither just nor an actual law, because that goes against the law of nature, right? So any human law has to jive with the law of nature in the same way, for instance, in America, that every local law ultimately must jive with the Constitution, right? So if you want to say in America that this law is unjust, you would say it's unconstitutional. It's the same kind of thing in parallel here. When Aquinas is like, if you want to say that this law is wrong, here, a human law, you have to say that it doesn't jive with natural law. However, we used to, even in this country, Jefferson, in the Declaration of Independence, when he talks about nature and nature's God, he talks about natural law. So, for instance, your rights to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness derive from natural law, not from human law. So any law that would take those away or infringe on them is an unjust law because it's not natural. Okay, he continues. But it must be noted that something may be derived from the natural law in two ways. First, as a conclusion from premises. Secondly, by way of determination of certain generalities. The first is like to that by which in sciences demonstrated conclusions are drawn from principles. Okay, so in other words, what is he talking about? The problem is, well, how do you derive these, human laws from laws of nature? And not only St. Thomas Aquinas, but really very few people that talk about natural law ever enumerate them. You know what I mean? Like, what do you mean? Let's write down all the natural laws. So it's difficult because when they're talking natural law, what they mean are the laws that we derive from science. And so you would be hard-pressed to list them all, not to mention they change, right? So natural law we get by observing nature, essentially. Okay, so the problem is, well, then how do you take that observation of nature, what is, and apply it to a law of how we ought to act, right? So that's what's at stake. While the second mode is likened to that whereby in the arts, general forms are particularized as to details. Thus, the craftsman needs to determine the general form of a house in some particular shape. Laws two ways. One, premise to conclusion. In other words, pure logic, right? That's not really the one we're talking about. The other one is you take the laws, take natural law in a way that you have it inside of you as a craftsman and you apply it to situations, right? So, you know, the natural law of the internal combustion engine, but it's going to be a little bit different from a, Chevy 305 to like a modern, Hemi 5.7, right? But nevertheless, the general principles are the same, but how you apply those principles in each case will slightly differ. Some things are therefore derived from the general principles of natural law by way of conclusions. One must not kill. Excuse me. May be derived as a conclusion from the principle that one should do no harm to man, while some are derived therefrom by way of determination. That is, the law of nature has it that the evildoer should be punished, but that he be punished this way or that is a determination of the law of nature. Right? So in other words, murder is against the natural law, of course. But do you imprison the murderer for life? Do you kill the murderer? Do you torture the murderer? That all depends. That's a derivation from the specifics of the natural law. That's all he's trying to say. So the last little bit here, accordingly, both modes of derivation are found in the human law, but those things which are derived in the first way are contained in human law not as emanating therefrom exclusively, but have the force from the natural law. But those things derived in the second way have no other force than that of human law. So, in other words, you could never really say murderers will not be punished. That would go against natural law. However, to say that murderers should receive capital punishment, that's merely a human law. So that could be proven right or wrong if we decide that it does not jive with natural law. Does that make sense? So human laws are not emanations. In other words, they don't come directly from, but they should be derived from and jive with natural law. However, as we know from human beings, in our political systems, sometimes we deviate from what is right. And that ultimately right here is what Aquinas is leaving room for. Now let's go back to our thing here. And the Isidore thing, it's not important for our purposes. So why don't we just leave question 95 here with what are the human laws beneficial to establish? Yeah, because they allow the discipline, mainly in the youth, to become virtuous and ultimately to be proficient in careers that keep society going. Number 2 is every human law derived from the natural law should be. If it's not derived from the natural law, it is not a law. All right, so let's see. We got question 96 coming up, and then we're done with Aquinas.